Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories where the people involved believe they encountered a Wendigo. These stories include a man who was hit with dread and fear, as well as a stench that seemed to follow him to his house while outside one night, a young woman who was out ghost hunting and may have attracted some unwanted attention that led to activity picking up around her home, and yet another instance where these beings seem to be able to invade and affect our dreams. But first, we start with a story where a man sees a white figure behind a cabin while visiting his friends. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Tennessee, where the original poster, or OP, encounters something bizarre while on a trip to visit his goddaughter. His encounter took place in Sevierville, Tennessee, which is in the eastern part of the state. Sevierville is located in Sevier County, Tennessee, which borders North Carolina, and sits in an area where the foothills of the Great Smokies give way to the Tennessee Valley. The city has a population of 17,889 people as of the 2020 census. On the night his encounter took place, the OP was in the backyard of the cabin they were at while visiting his friend, playing fetch with the dog, a pit bull he describes as the sweetest dog he has ever met. They had been at it for about half an hour when the smell of rotting flesh hit the OP's nose. He says it didn't worry him too much because they were in the mountains and he figured it was a dead animal on one of the hills. So he continued his game with the dog until the dog settled down with a stick to chew on. The OP took a seat on a log and enjoyed the music he was listening to while watching the stars in the night sky above. The smell of rotting flesh still hung heavy in the air, but he once again brushed it off. However, after about 5 minutes of sitting there, he was struck with the odd feeling that he was being watched. This was when he noticed the dog's ears perk up as if she heard something. Being that the OP had headphones in, he couldn't hear anything. He looked to where the dog was looking and saw a white flash dart behind one of the trees. He quickly stood up and called the dog to him. She came, tail tucked between her legs, as the OP looked toward the tree where he saw the white flash. He says here that the smell had gotten so strong that he wanted to gag. Then, this thing peered out from behind the tree. He says at first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but he got a pretty good look at this creature for a long moment before he got out of there. He describes the creature as being at least 8 feet tall, skinny, with huge black eyes and blonde hair that was of decent length. He says he had never been so scared in his life. Before he knew it, he was about 20 feet from the porch with a dog hot on his heels. Neither of them looked back, and he ran into the house, telling everyone what he saw. They all thought he was seeing things, but his friends say they had never seen the dog that spooked. She was hiding under their daughter's crib. He ends his post by saying that as he was typing out his encounter, they heard a man screaming behind the cabin. He also says there was no one within a 30-mile radius of them. He asked that anyone please help him out as he doesn't know much about this sort of thing. He was still shaking as he typed out his encounter. Just like with many signs that are repeated during cryptid encounters, the rotting stench that fills an area and usually overcomes the person is a telltale sign that a cryptid is nearby. And it is usually described just like in this story, where it becomes so strong it almost makes the person either gag or vomit. Then there is the feeling of being watched. That is probably the feeling most described in these encounters. This would be enough for me to believe it was a cryptid that was nearby, but in this story we got a physical description of the being. The description given by the OP points to this thing either being a Wendigo or a crawler, being that they are close in appearance. The thing that throws me off though and makes me think that this is not a crawler is that the being had hair. Crawlers are almost never described as having hair. I say almost because never say never, and we don't know enough about these things to know for sure one way or the other. But something here just makes me think this is not a crawler. The OP also described this creature as being at least 8 feet tall. This, at least to me, points to this thing being a possible Wendigo or something else, as crawlers are never described as being that tall. At the end of the story, the OP says they heard a man screaming behind the cabin, and in another post he shares a video where they captured the screaming. If I'm being honest though, while it does sound extremely creepy, it does sound like either a mountain lion or a bobcat rather than something else. If you've ever heard either of these animals, or for that matter a fox or anything else that can do this, scream at night, you'd think someone is being killed. It is beyond creepy, but at the same time, if you've heard it before, it's easy to pick out as coming from an animal. This was the general consensus in the comments, and my personal opinion upon hearing the sounds. But whether or not they captured this creature screaming or an animal in the night, it doesn't take away what he saw or what he felt during his encounter, which I do believe was a cryptid. What do you think he saw that night? The next story of this episode comes to us from a poster who experienced something very strange one night while outside that he wonders might have been a Wendigo. It does not say where he lives, just that it is a rural area and that he has pigs that have to be locked into their indoor pen after dark. The original poster had gone outside to lock up his pigs for the night, taking his flashlight with him, being that it got very dark very quick once he left the light given off by his porch light. When he walked outside, the same night he posted his story online, he immediately felt a deep sense of dread and fear, as he puts it. He convinced himself he was just psyching himself out and continued on toward the pig pen. When he was approximately halfway to the pen, he was overcome by a stench that he says smelled like old roadkill. He dismissed the smell as a raccoon getting hit and lying in the road rotting. As he walked, he thought he caught sight of something moving just outside of his flashlight's range. Upon swinging the light in that direction, though, he saw nothing. He adds here that the whole time he was outside, he felt like he was being watched. He continued to the pig pen, took care of what he needed to, and began walking back to his house. But as he walked back, he was overcome with the urge to take off running. He also says the rotting smell seemed to follow him the whole way back to his house. He fought off the urge to run, however, but he did walk faster than he normally did. He ends his post by saying that he lives in an area where Wendigo are said to be, and that he does not live in the woods, but there used to be woods where his house is now. He asks at the end of his post if anyone who reads his encounter thinks it could have been a Wendigo, or if he just freaked himself out. He also asked if it could have been something else entirely. The feeling of being watched, having that sense of dread and fear, and the rotting smell are all indicators that a cryptid is close by. One commenter says the rotting smell is indicative of a Wendigo, but I've covered a lot of stories with a lot of different cryptids, and this smell shows up along with a lot of them. Given that he lives in an area he says where Wendigo are supposed to be, definitely adds it to the list of suspects, but without a clear description of the creature, it's impossible to say what this was around his home that night. But I do believe it was a cryptid. Another thing I want to point out here is the strong urge to run the OP had and him resisting doing so. It's often said in dealing with most cryptids that you should not take off running because they will give chase. This is especially true when it comes to crawlers and Wendigo from what I've heard and read. The OP did the right thing by not running and continuing to walk toward his house. What do you think followed the OP that night? And what advice would you give him moving forward? The next post comes from a poster who was out one night with her boyfriend and roommate when they experienced something strange. But it didn't stop there, as weird things began happening around their home. This story takes place in Independence, Oregon, about 20 minutes south of Salem and 10 minutes from Western Oregon University, according to the OP. The OP, her boyfriend, and her roommate were out one night doing some ghost hunting when they saw a light ahead of them on the train tracks they were close to. They at first thought it was a person walking the tracks or maybe someone riding a bike, but then the light just disappeared. Brush lines both sides of the tracks, so they decided to head toward where they saw the light and check things out. But they saw no one and nothing. However, the OP says she got a really bad vibe as they continued walking down the tracks in that direction, so they turned around. They thought they could have seen a spirit of a miner, as there used to be coal mines in that area. But the OP's boyfriend had a different thought and mentioned to her that it could have been a skinwalker or a Wendigo. He also later told her that he got the feeling that night that they were being watched. The OP says she has also had that same feeling while out walking along the Williamate River. She says the bad vibes she got that night while walking the train tracks is the same feeling she got while walking the river. She ends her post saying they wanted to go back out and further investigate the area before asking if anyone else has experienced anything there. Now, I will admit here that this story is one I would normally pass on and not include in an episode, as it sounds more like a paranormal experience rather than anything else. But the OP replied to a commenter with some very interesting information that makes me think this might actually be a cryptid. The OP says in her response that as of the post, they hadn't been back out to the area, but weird things did begin happening around their home. They started hearing strange noises outside the windows on the second floor of where they live, and they all started having nightmares. Also, the roommate's boyfriend visited and went out exploring a park in the middle of the night, which prompts the OP to say that whatever this thing might be is back on their scent. I've always heard and said before, be careful what you go out in the world searching for, because you don't know what you might invite into your life. Whether it be intentional or inadvertently, you might invite something into your life that you won't like. That's why I will always advise against a Ouija board, participating in a seance, or anything similar. I've heard way too many horror stories about the things that can happen. I bring this up because I believe the same thing about cryptids. They seem to take an interest in us as humans and are drawn to us for whatever reason. Going out looking for these creatures could possibly make them take an interest in you. If you've never heard of the hitchhiker effect, you might want to look into it. It is especially true with Sasquatch, and I have heard a lot of stories where these creatures follow people home, especially if they go out hunting for them. Now, I know the OP in this story wasn't out looking for cryptids. They were out ghost hunting, which is something I also would advise against doing. But they seem to have drawn the interest of something as weird things began happening around their home not long after the events of their story. I included this story with other Wendigo stories because she said they started having nightmares, and this is something that is usually associated with either Wendigo or skinwalkers. If I were them, I would ignore what is happening around their home and definitely not go back out to the area or let anyone else go out there either. Whatever this thing is that has seemingly followed them to their home and is now affecting their dreams should lose interest and move on, if they continue to ignore it. What do you think about this one? And what would you advise the OP do in her situation? The final story of this episode is a bit different from the stories I normally do in that it does not involve a physical encounter with a being. However, I have spoken about how these creatures, Wendigo especially, seem to be able to affect and invade our dreams, and this is exactly what seems to be happening here. There is also some very interesting information given by a commenter who puts a fascinating spin on this phenomenon. The original poster does not say where exactly her story takes place, but that is kind of irrelevant anyway, given that this story revolves around her dreams. The OP began having weird dreams about a creature, with a specific one making her turn to the internet to ask the following question: why do I have these dreams? The dream she posted involves her sister that she actually says is more of a nightmare. In the dream, she and her sister were walking through the woods. She says that her sister is about 5 years old in the dream. They were walking a path that would lead them to their grandparents' house, but this path does not exist in real life. However, when she has a dream about these woods, the path is always there. The OP and her sister continued walking down the trail only to start seeing trash bags hanging from tree branches. They continued on, with the OP holding her sister's hand just a little bit tighter, now feeling like they were being watched and that she needed to protect her sister. As they walked, the trash bags got bigger and bigger and eventually looked like blood was dripping from the plastic. The bloodstained plastic eventually took the shape of bodies in the bags. The sight of a deer brought the OP and her sister to a halt in the middle of the path. The deer they saw was decaying and had yellow eyes. What really caught her attention, though, was the deer's antlers. They were so big that they looked like tree branches. In fact, she says you couldn't tell a difference between the antlers and the branches. Just like with the tree she and her sister had already walked past, there were trash bags hanging from the antlers. However, these bags were different in that the OP could see the shapes of bodies within them. But they were bodies she recognized as her family members. She looked back, but her sister was no longer there. She looked down at her hand to see her sister's dismembered hand in hers. At this moment, she forced herself to wake up. She ends her post by saying that she has had many dreams about those woods and is seeking advice. Now I know what some of you may be thinking. It's probably the same thing I was thinking when I finished reading her post. What does this have to do with Wendigo? Well, as I scrolled down to the comments, I came across one I found very intriguing. It came from a user I've seen on many other Skinwalker and Wendigo stories. He says he is Native American and has studied lore involving Skinwalkers and Wendigo for a very long time and has had encounters with each being. He told the OP that it's possible a Wendigo spirit could be targeting her because in the dreams, Wendigo spirits take the form of a decaying humanoid deer. He does say that if she lives in southern states, that it could be a Skinwalker. And by southern states, I'm assuming he means not just the South, but across the southern part of the United States. The OP then tells him that she no longer lives where the dream originated, but instead 30 minutes away. And the last one she had was the ghost of the little girl who used to live there before she did, telling her she was safe. She then asked him if what he says is true, what precautions she could take. His advice to her would either be to sage the property or have a priest bless it. He goes on to say that if this is a Wendigo, she needs to keep something flammable nearby as they can only be killed by fire, and if it's a Skinwalker, she should keep a cross close by to ward it off, and use a dream catcher to keep the bad dreams away. Luckily though, the last dream the OP had was 6 months before she made her post, so they seem to be dying down. First of all, I'm glad the dreams are dying down and the OP no longer feels like she is in danger. If what the commenter said is true, then these beings can invade our dreams. This isn't the first story I've done on this channel and certainly not the first one I've heard where this happens. I've mentioned before my own recurring dream that happened the same exact way every time leading up to me confronting a dark force in my home I believe was a demon. So this, for me, hits a little close to home, but I do think these things have the ability to affect our dreams. The evidence is there. I don't think it is a coincidence each one of her nightmares involving her being in that same forest every time. Just like with my own experience, I would have the same dream the same exact way each time only to wake up to a presence in my bedroom. It doesn't sound like from her post and her comments that the OP had the same exact dream every time, but they did all seem to take place in the same setting. Also, there have been many instances where cryptids have affected people's feelings, make them feel physically ill, and mess with their heads during encounters. Who's to say they can't take it one step further and invade our dreams as well? This especially seems to be the case with Wendigo and Skinwalkers. It really is a mystery that I'm not sure we will ever have all the answers to. But in any case, I'm glad the OP is doing well. What do you think about this one? Do you believe these beings have the power to invade and/or affect our dreams? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.